Welcome back, my people of YouTube. And you may recall about a little over a month ago, I did a ranking of all 10 of the Renaissance Disney films, the 1990s golden era Disney animation, the peak of musicals. And I decided, why not go a little bit further? Let's do the decade after. Let's do the 2000s. So, the 2000s, the decade in which I was born. The 2000s Disney films were some of the first movies I saw as a kid, so I have plenty of nostalgia, but I could definitely admit the 2000s was a major drop-off of quality after the 90s. Of course, there were some peaks, but oh my goodness, was there some dog shit that we're going to be getting into in this video. It was painful to watch some of these movies after watching the mostly great Renaissance, but that's pretty much it. We have 14 movies to go over. I'm going to be ranking them from worst to best. Practically every mainline animated film I'm going to be going over, excluding the Tigger movie and Dinosaur. But other than that, every animated film from the 2000s I'm going to be going over. So with little time to waste, let's get into the 2000s. So number 14 and number 13, I can flip-flop on any given day. But objectively speaking, I can say that 13 is objectively the better movie. It does have some qualities to it that, although I didn't like at all, I can see the traditional Disney fan liking and enjoying, especially the traditional Disney child. But number 14, kids should not watch this movie. This movie is an absolute disgust. This isn't only the worst 2000s Disney movie, this is the worst Disney movie I have ever seen so far. First things first, I want to talk about the CGI, and this is only a 2006 movie. In the grand scheme of things, that wasn't that long ago, and even movies before The Wild, there were Disney films with CGI that were just far better. I mean, the first two Toy Story movies were out before 2006, Monsters Inc. was out before 2006, I'm pretty sure The Incredibles had a lot of CGI qualities. So I don't understand why this movie looks so dog shit. It is just a low quality CGI product through and through. I mean, this is the most wealthy studio in practically all of animation, so I don't understand why they can't put a little bit more effort even into the main characters. The main character, Samson, even watching him talk sometimes, it's an absolute disgust. And that's not even to mention the talking British koala, Nigel. First things first, there's no reason why he's British. But oh my god, he ends up being a twist villain by the end of the movie, and it makes no sense. He's not sinister, he is the utter definition of annoying. His jokes don't hit at all, and just watching him talk is like, oh my god, I can't believe I am watching this. The thoughts that were going through my head when watching The Wild were, what am I doing with my life? This is absolutely disgusting. I am about to start crying. So the talking koala Nigel is likely the worst character in all of Disney, and the second worst character is probably the talking python in this movie. And let's get into the more technical aspects of this film. The writing is very bland. It's a blatant ripoff of The Lion King with a slightly more fatherhood-focused turn on the script. In this film, the son of Samson, who is named Benny, gets trapped in a ship that sends him like across the country or something, or across New York. And that leads to probably the only, I guess, quality scene in the entire movie, when Samson and his animal friends go through New York, and it plays a Coldplay song, and it's kind of a decent scene. But other than that, this movie is just so disgusting that it's honestly enjoyable at sometimes. Number 13, which I'm going to get into in a little bit, has qualities that I can see making it a good movie. But there is nothing about this movie that should even exist. It genuinely feels like a parody for the majority of the movie. It feels like a parody on Madagascar. It feels like a parody on The Lion King. And there is nothing good I can say about this movie. I mean, maybe the main character, Samson, is decent. But other than that, please do not waste your time on The Wild. It is probably the most ill-conceived movie in all of Disney, the worst received movie in all of Disney, and I can 100% see why. So I cannot believe that I'm actually having some sympathy for Home on the Range after tearing a new one for The Wild, because Home on the Range, I hate this movie far more than I do The Wild. But I can admit, this movie does have more watchable qualities than The Wild through and through. First things first, the 2D animation, it is an eye catcher. It's soft to the eyes. I like the Wild West setting. And you know, the classic 2D kind of Cartoon Network special kind of animation, it makes this more watchable. At least it makes the animation a lot more enjoyable. And it kind of set the scene for a lot of the animation style that we would get in the 2010s, in my opinion. So in terms of establishing a 2D animation feature, it kind of is commendable in that sense, but oh my god, does it absolutely fail in the technical values, and does it fail in bringing back 2D animation? Holy shit. Firstly, if the characters in this movie aren't talking pieces of cardboard, then they are just gut-wrenchingly annoying characters to begin with. First things first, the horse, Buck. Every time he's on the screen, he's either screaming or just doing a stupid act that is not funny to anyone older than 3 years old, and as an average movie watcher, he's just not funny, and he's just wicked annoying and ruins the scene every single time he shows up. And then the main villain, Alla Beta Slim, ends up being this yodeler guy, and he's not sinister at all. And, you know, they play him out at the beginning of the film like this big bad guy, but once he shows up, he ends up being this yodeler, like I said, and it turns into like this laser light show acid trip once he shows up and he's singing a song, and it just kills the Wild West feel of the movie so bad for like a good 4 to 5 minutes. And the 3 main characters of the movie are 3 female cows, and all of them are kind of like different women. They're pretty mature women, and they all act in different ways. One of them is actually voiced by Jennifer Tilly, who does the same voice acting for the Bride of Chucky, and every single time she's talking, I just think of Chucky, which is not a pleasant thought for a kids movie, and I'm just hoping that most kids, when they see this, they don't think of Chucky at the same time, similar to the way I did. So the 3 main characters in this movie, Grace, Miss Calloway, and Maggie, they're not that bad. They're definitely the best characters in the movie, but they don't really shine until the second half of the movie, and I hate to say it, but the first 45 minutes of this movie are annoying and boring. So in order to bring me back for the second half, you need to be quite the grand ending, and unless you're on the same ending caliber of like Beauty and the Beast, you're not going to be able to bring me back at all. So this movie is practically dog shit to me. A little bit better than The Wild objectively, but yeah, these first 2 movies on this list get a 0 out of 10 from me. If you haven't catch so far, it's not looking pretty good for mid-2000s Disney. And expectedly, moving on to number 12, that theme of whackness will continue. At number 12, I have Chicken Little. Little to no surprise that this was going to be at the bottom half of this list. And no, my youngin' self, toddler self, was not naive to believe that this was a good movie, just like I was around the same time with a bunch of other animated films, such as Monsters vs. Aliens or Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs, 2 movies that I probably would dislike heavily nowadays. But anyways, Chicken Little is such an oddity. It is such a weird movie that makes completely no sense whatsoever. It starts off as a baseball film, or essentially a baseball film, in which Chicken Little is just trying to get his dad's approval, and he's growing up in a community where he is just shat on, disrespected, and he's trying to prove himself. But as soon as he is opportune to prove himself, all of a sudden it's a space alien sci-fi film in which Chicken Little is technically put at stake to protect his entire community, the same community in which shits on him and disrespects him. So even me as a child, I thought, why Chicken Little waste the time to try to prove himself? It's literally, he's wasting his time. He's trying to prove himself, make others think he's cool in a community that already dislikes him, and I thought that was a strange message to prove to kids. And I still find it strange that with the majority of animated films that came out around the time when I was a toddler and I was watching, I could give half a shit about the messaging in these films because it was entertaining enough with the stupid comedy and the animation to keep me enthralled. But I was not naive enough, like I said, at that age to ignore the plot in Chicken Little. I was young enough and even smart enough to understand that this plotline was weird, wacky, and uninteresting and cliche to say the least. and that is not a good thing to say for a film coming from a 5-year-old. But I have to be honest, there is some charming nostalgic factors that I do enjoy about Chicken Little, but that's not to say that Chicken Little is a good movie. It's one of the worst Disney films in the 2000s, pretty handedly, but I am a fan of the Jimmy Neutron style animation. I know a lot of people shit on the animation and I think it's hideous, but I kind of like the plasticky early Nickelodeon vibes of the film. I do enjoy it, I do find it charming, and I do think some of the character designs are so whack and out of left field that I do find them enjoying quite a bit. I also like the setting in Chicken Little, how it's set in this little town area with the city hall and schools and houses everywhere, but it's all like smushed into this tiny little area. And that's one thing that I do commend about films when they do have a focus point on it. I really like when the setting in a Disney film is focused on and enhanced to make the film all the more enjoyable. And I do think the setting in Chicken Little, while basic, is done in a pretty interesting way. So as a finalizing point for Chicken Little, yes, this is not a good movie because when it comes to technical aspects like storytelling, writing, characters, it falls flat in all three of those categories. If it doesn't just fall flat, it is below average and terrible. But I do have some nostalgic feelings for this movie. I like the location, I think some of the characters are funny, and I just think there is some charm to how stupid this movie is. But then again, even as a toddler, I thought this movie was stupid. But looking back, and now that I'm technically a young adult now, I can't help but feel some kind of sympathy for Chicken Little. So I give it a 3 out of 10. I don't think it's the worst Disney film like some people think, so I'm going to put it at number 12. At number 11, we have our first sequel film, Peter Pan 2: Return to Neverland. And why not, after half a century of waiting for a second installment to such a iconic story in the original 1953 Peter Pan, how about we just take everything that made the first one special and just touch on it in the very slightest and arguably drop off in so many of those amazing magical qualities to just make one of the most average, soulless, and boring sequels to a Disney film in a while. And that catalog of sequels is full of soulless and boring movies. And I know plenty of people don't really include this in the post-Renaissance listing since it's not an original title and it is a sequel installment, but I thought it was important enough. 50 years after the original, it could hold something special, so I did end up including it onto this list. But anyways, this is just a harmless movie. It's only an hour and 10 minutes, and not to spoil it, but nothing important happens in the sequel at all. It literally feels like Disney just plopped this out of pure boredom and for maybe a possible cash grab. And if you're craving a good Neverland magical tale, just watch the 50s original or watch the 1991 Robin Williams movie Hook, which is actually a really magical, fun, and epic journey that includes Peter Pan and the Lost Boys. But literally, I'm writing this 15 minutes after watching the movie, and I've already practically forgotten about everything that happened. It was literally such a quick, we meet the characters, some stupid shit goes on in the middle, and then there's an epic, or quote-unquote epic fight with Captain Hook at the end of the movie. Luckily, on the bright side, the reanimation of all these classical characters is pretty nice. I like how they just took the original animation from the 50s and just polished it slightly to make it look more modern, but they didn't make any drastic changes that were a failure or recreating the characters or anything like that. It was just a nice reanimation of the original character designs that we love. Peter Pan doesn't look bad, Captain Hook doesn't look bad, Wendy and Jane look pretty good, and the first showing of Bloomsbury in this movie and at the end of the film are beautiful. Bloomsbury is one of my favorite locations in Disney. Speaking of Disney, I still think my favorite piece of Peter Pan media has to be the Peter Pan's flight ride in Disney World. I love that ride to death, bro. Now that I've perhaps maybe owed a couple of compliments to the movie, let me explain why I would rather watch paint dry than watch this movie again. When it comes to writing and bringing upon new characteristics to the characters 50 plus years later, they did absolutely nothing and they botched everybody. I mean, everybody in this movie is so damn soulless, besides a couple of stupid comedic cuts and perhaps some of the fighting scenes. Other than that, these characters are complete cardboard boxes. Captain Hook is probably the biggest disgrace in my opinion. He's not menacing at all. He is not sinister in the slightest. His motives are the same as the original and they are just wicked gimmicky. And how are you going to fail with such a legendary villain like you did in this film after having half a century to make him more evil and to rebuild his script. Like, I know that 2000s era of Disney was basically like the 2020s of hip hop. It was basically just shit out as much content as possible for the money, so they didn't really focus on the heart and soul of these movies. But dude, you were gonna take a legendary story from the 50s and just botch it this badly? Make like at least an original if you're gonna make it wicked shitty. Don't take such a legendary storyline. Peter Pan's character was botched almost just as much as Captain Hook's character was. He was pretty annoying for the entire film, or at least when he was in the movie. He was practically irrelevant for like 75% of the movie, and this was Jane's movie to take over. This was like following Jane's storyline for the first 3/4 of the movie. So yeah, they also practically killed Peter Pan's character as well. And the Lost Boys in this movie, oh my god, they are just so damn annoying. Anyways, I don't want to shit on such a legendary story such as Peter Pan anymore. If I want to watch a nice Neverland tale, I could just watch the Robin Williams Hook movie. So, without any more time to waste talking about such a hideous sequel film, let's move on to number 10. Alright, at number 10, I have Pooh's Heffalump movie. Now, I said I'm not going to include the Tigger movie, but I did waste my time to watch Pooh's Heffalump movie, so I am going to include it on this list, just because I don't want to say the 75 minutes I spent watching that movie was a complete waste of time. But honestly, I don't really think this movie was a big waste of time. I thought it was really pleasing to watch. The animation was beautiful, and it was just a nice, charming, cute Christopher Robin story. In fact, I like a lot more about this movie than I dislike, and I think at number 10, this is where we make the turn for the better. At this point, I don't really think these movies are downright shit. I think they are probably right below average to just about average, and of course as we go further, they're gonna get way better. Anyways, what's good about Pooh's Heffalump movie? Of course, me, like many others, I love the countryside storybook art style. I think that the Winnie the Pooh aesthetic is likely the best from any of the original Disney stories pre-1980, specifically from the underrated Silver Age. I also thought it was a decently charming storyline to follow as well. How it was kind of a going into the darkness, going into the unknown storyline. And I liked the chemistry between Roo and Lumpy as well, even though I was a bit skeptical of Roo as a main character, since he's essentially one of the less important and more annoying characters from Winnie the Pooh's group. But it ended up working, and I also thought that Kanga was a great character in this movie, and Pooh is great as well when he does get the screen time to be great. Jim Cummings does absolutely amazing voicing Winnie the Pooh in this movie as well. However, on the contrary, the storyline just isn't nearly as memorable to be considered higher on this list, especially given that this is also not an original Disney title similar to Neverland. I also thought that although the aforementioned characters were good in here, the other members of the group weren't that strong, such as Piglet, Eeyore, and Tigger. And I also thought Rabbit is specifically shitty in here and is even annoying at times. So I think in terms of characters, this is like a split 50-50. I thought Roo was decent as a main character. I thought Lumpy was pretty great as a new character. Winnie the Pooh was great, Kanga was great, and everyone else was kind of meh. So overall, Pooh's Heffalump just isn't as important or entertaining enough to be considered higher, although I don't see any major flaws about it. It's just an easy to watch movie that overall is forgettable at the end of the day. So let's move on to number 9. At number 9, we're moving back to the originals, and actually a movie that's pretty important to Disney and pretty innovative in terms of mainline Disney films in the 2000s. And of course, I'm talking about the 2007 3D animated movie, Meet the Robinsons. Now, Meet the Robinsons is a movie that a lot of people love and cherish, especially in retrospect, because it's a theme that a lot of people like this movie more now than they originally did when it first came out. Because I know this movie is overall, throughout the grand scheme of things and throughout the past 15 years, has had a mixed bag of reviews, but within the past couple years, there has been a cult following from this movie that has been growing on the internet, and I don't really see it all too much. I wasn't the biggest fan of Meet the Robinsons, although I do think it's practically a 50-50 split of things that I liked and things that I disliked and things that I thought that didn't really age too well. So to say the least, Meet the Robinsons is definitely a hit or miss movie, and unfortunately for me, I'm on the latter half. And to add, I didn't really like this movie when I was young, maybe around 5 or 6. And after rewatch, a lot of the same issues that I originally had with the film when I first watched it stayed the same, and it feels kind of odd saying that, knowing that I'm now 18 and the last time I watched it, I was maybe a first grader, and so many of my opinions, so many of my comprehensive skills in movies have grown, but I still have the same exact issues that I had when I was 6 years old, and that is not a good sign. First things first, I wasn't really a big fan of the Robinsons family in this movie, and that sucks considering that they are practically the heart and soul of this movie. They are the family the movie is named after, and what the movie is basically based around. And that's specifically for Uncle Art and Bud Robinson. These two characters, their jokes don't really hit, they're not that funny, and they're kind of corny, and they didn't age too well. And I feel basically for the entire family of the Robinsons, the jokes just haven't really aged all too well throughout the years. However, alternatively, I do think there are good characters. I'll give a shout out to Franny Robinson. I thought she was one of the rare good characters in the Robinson family. And I also do think that the general core characters of Meet the Robinsons are pretty well written and pretty entertaining characters to say the least. That goes for, of course, Lewis, the main protagonist. I thought he portrays the orphan character really well. Wilbur was an amazing mentor-style character. And the bowler hat guy was such an amazing, funny, and witty villain. I loved him as a villain. He's one of my favorite villains from 2000s Disney for sure. On top of the core characters, I also thought that the setting was pretty cool as well. And that goes for the present in this movie at the orphanage. And I thought that the future was a pretty cool setting too. It just kind of sucks that the future was majorly taken up by screen time of the Robinsons family and their outdated and unfunny jokes throughout the screen time there. Ultimately, I would like to say that I do want to like this movie a lot. I think it's a really cool movie in its roots, and I think that the synopsis being set in the future and time travel was pretty cool as well. I guess I just wasn't in a mood of sci-fi both times that I watched this movie. That goes for when I was really young and when I watched it not too long ago. And ultimately, I just think I prefer other time travel movies more. That can go for practically, I will say, Back to the Future, even though I'm still not the biggest Back to the Future fan. And it also goes for Peabody and Sherman. I highly prefer Peabody and Sherman over this movie. I'm also not the biggest fan of the character designs in this movie. I do like the 3D animation, but I think some of the character designs are pretty strange in this movie. And that goes for Lewis, although I think he's a good character when it comes to writing, and Uncle Art. And some of the characters are pretty funny too. The dinosaur looks pretty outdated, and some of the Robinsons look pretty funny as well. So like I said earlier, it's practically a 50-50 split in terms of what I liked about this movie and what I disliked about this movie. I don't think that Meet the Robinsons is essentially a bad movie. I just think it's pretty average to forgettable, and I think I prefer other time travel movies far more. At number 8, I have Bolt, and fun fact, back in the day, Bolt was my shit. It was one of my very first movies as a kid. I remember seeing this and The Incredible Hulk as the first memories of watching movies as a child. So it's reasonable to say why I like to defend these two movies with my heart rather than beat them down like the general movie fandom does. And I'm not gonna lie, upon rewatch, I thought I was going to hate this movie, but you know, on rewatch, Bolt is an okay movie. I will say I thought the voice acting was odd to say the least. I disliked Bolt's adult voice, and I will say it's probably more fitting if he was voiced by, a teenager or at least an adult impersonating a teenager instead of just having a full-blown adult voice for Bolt's character. And overall, I do like Veteran Cat's character and how she played the mentor role for Bolt throughout the middle act of the movie, but her Boston accent was almost unbearable. Besides that, I actually think that the city scenes and the action cuts throughout this movie are pretty damn entertaining. They blew my mind as a little kid, and I still think they hold up pretty well to date and kind of mesh in well with, later 2010s Disney action films, kind of like Wreck-It Ralph, although not being on that caliber. I just think the action scenes just aged pretty well. Another thing that I think aged pretty well about Bolt was the CGI. The animation actually holds up to date. On rewatch, these characters don't look clunky, they don't look awkward, they don't have weird, strange character designs. And even the villain, all of the character designs are pretty great and hold up really well in 2023. I also like the connection between Penny and Bolt in this movie, how they were broken up in the beginning through middle of the movie, and then they got back together at the end in a very grand and spectacular way. I love that about the movie. However, Bolt is still kinda in that mid-tier category to low on this list, so there are some big negatives holding it back. For one, I thought Calico was kind of a poor villain, although having a really menacing design and having the cat's eye and being wicked sinister. Other than that, I thought he was just pretty stale He didn't really do anything that entertaining, and he didn't really become too evil until the end of the movie. And you know, he was just kind of a failure as a villain in terms of writing and technicality. I also thought that like the Hollywood theme and how Penny and Bolt are supposed to be like famous actors and actresses was kind of a failure. It definitely didn't deliver every single time it was supposed to, and specifically towards the ending. And the agent was a god-awful character throughout the entire movie. Every single time he was on the screen, I wanted to punch him in the face, bro. He is definitely a bottom tier Disney character. But at number 8 and higher, I think this is the turn from where we're getting actually some really decent and memorable movies. I don't think Bolt is a bad movie at all. I just think the movies listed higher are more beautiful, have better characters, have better animation, and are just more memorable overall. So at number 8, I'm going to put Bolt, one of my favorite movies as a child, and upon rewatch, still not that bad. At number 7, I have Atlantis, The Lost Empire, and now this is where things get juicy because from 7 to 1, there was really no extremely overpowering flaws in any of these movies. It's just 7 to 1. They're all so tight, and it was really just hard to make the decision from 7 to 1. But I ended up going with Atlantis, and I like to say all the time, while I don't think this is one of Disney's best films, it is definitely amongst the coolest. I knew before even going into Atlantis, because it wasn't a movie I was able to watch until recently, I knew going into it that I was going to have a great time just because the eye candy I knew I was going to witness whilst watching. And speaking of that eye candy is nothing short of amazing. First things first, the character animation, flawless. The industrial 3D style of the architecture and setting, flawless. I mean, there are some 3D cuts in this movie where the animators are clearly focusing on the background and the camera is set back from like a really far view where it shows like the grand scheme of the room, kind of like the preparation scene or when they're underwater, and it just makes the background detail so intricate and it makes the setting all the more merrier. Also, the libraries and the design of each room, especially towards the beginning of the movie, it really elevates that early 20th century aesthetic. And I absolutely love when Disney films like to explore figments of mythology or like the past and history. For example, you got Hercules, Mulan, Emperor's New Groove, just to name a few. But I don't think Disney has ever taken a more interesting route with mythology or history with Atlantis, The Lost Empire. I mean, they explored Atlantis. That is absolutely dope. I mean, I can go on and on and on about the world building and the setting of Atlantis, along with the Atlanteans that kind of show up in the middle of the movie, but you gotta watch it to really understand what I'm coming from, because I can go on for days about how beautiful the world building is in this movie. Luckily, there were also some great secondary characters in this movie. I thought the additions to Milo's group for the expedition were pretty cool. My favorites were Vincenzo, Strong Bear, and kind of a villain, Helga. Unfortunately, there was some piss poor characters as well. For example, Gaishin and Jebediah. I think their jokes never really hit, and I also think the voice acting is just really annoying, childish, and also doesn't hit. But on that same note, I do think there are more great characters than there are bad characters. And luckily, Rourke was a great villain. He was an amazing twist villain by the end. He reminded me of the Colonel from Avatar or like Clayton from Tarzan. He was just a really masculine and hard-ass villain, and I love that about him. And I also want to talk about one con that I had in mind throughout watching this movie. I do think the pacing was kind of strange because it felt like it took way too long to actually get into the good stuff of Atlantis, because they really exaggerate the 3D animation, and although I like the 3D animation, it's a long time to get to that part where there's actually some stuff going on. And especially at the ending, I feel like the movie could have ended 20 minutes earlier if they didn't just hit us with a bunch of neon explosion scenes and all that stuff that is basically eye candy that we already got earlier in the film and in plentiful amounts. To me, it just became way over theatrical by the end, and I don't know if anybody else caught that, but I feel there was way too many drawn out, over theatrical, overly bright scenes in this movie. All in all, Atlantis is definitely one of the coolest and most beautifully animated Disney films to ever come out, and I liked 80% of the characters. I just think there was way too many or way too long fleshed out over theatrical scenes towards the ending, and I feel it could have ended like 15-20 minutes earlier. But I'm glad that I watched Atlantis more recently and during a time in my life where I could appreciate beautiful animation more than I did when I was little, when I was all about stupid and disgusting, outdated jokes. Okay, so Fantasia 2000 might just be the most Disney thing I have ever watched. And for what it is and what it represents, I see no overpowering flaws whatsoever. I will say, being a movie with no dialogue and multiple parts completely changing each time, I think those are two factors that automatically hold this film back from being top 5. Still, I loved almost all little sequences in here, if you may call them that. Firstly, the flying whale one at the beginning was an amazing introduction with some of the most stunning 3D animation I've ever seen in a Disney product. And then the second one, Rhapsody in Blue, is just as flawless and just as jaw-dropping as it was back in second grade music class. I mean, my goodness, the way the blue and purple sceneries just bring the city to life in Rhapsody in Blue, and the awesome, flawless addition of the jazz, gospel, soulful music. Dude, it is just mesmerizing and so memorable, and honestly, without any exaggeration, may just be my favorite 10 to 15 minutes of Disney media ever. Unfortunately, after Rhapsody in Blue, it does kind of fall off a little bit. The Toy Soldier one was not that bad, but the Pink Flamingo one definitely was a drop off. I think in terms of storytelling, the pictures weren't really telling that great of a story. And really the only thing catching about it was the nice bouncy piano rhythmic music in the background that I thought was really down to roots in Disney. And that's something I will say about the entirety of Fantasia 2000. Just the constant horns and saxophones and piano music. It's just such an ode to, the beginning of Disney back in the 1920s and 30s. It's just such a nod to golden age of Disney, and I love that about Fantasia 2000 as a secondary movie to a film that was released back in, I think, 1942 with the original Fantasia. The last couple sequences were pretty good too. You had the DuckTales one, the Sorcerer's Apprentice with Mickey Mouse, and probably a top 3 sequence in all of Fantasia 2000 with the Firebird Suite as the very last closing sequence. And the charming piano music just keeps up and probably gets even better towards the ending, and that is especially the case in Sorcerer's Apprentice. However, at the end of the day, of course, having no dialogue and being broken up into multiple little sequences instead of being one cohesive story with dialogue and storytelling, it's not the easiest to rewatch as a whole and much easier to watch as singular parts of 10 to 15 minutes, and that can lead to me forgetting about certain parts like Toy Soldier or the Flamingo one, and instead picking up parts like Flying Whale or the Rhapsody in Blue parts more often. And still, for what it is, Fantasia 2000 was an amazing, colorful, beautifully animated musical animation, and there's really no complaints about this movie other than the fact that it's much harder to watch on rewatch than other Disney films from the 2000s. Ultimately, I think Fantasia 2000 is a beautifully animated 3D musical, and I see all the acclaim for it. Alright, if you were wondering if I was Team Atlantis or Team Treasure Planet, this will answer your question, but I just like Treasure Planet ever so slightly. I think I just prefer more of the 3D animation in this movie, and I probably prefer a little bit more of the aesthetic in Treasure Planet as well. And I specifically want to give a nod to Spaceport, which is this place that they go to at the beginning of the movie, 10 minutes in. This is one of the most beautiful locations in all of 2000s Disney. The from afar cuts and the 3D animated scenes are absolutely gorgeous, and I'm so glad that they fit this in right at the beginning of the film, instead of just having a lot of boring drawn on dialogue scenes before getting into the good stuff. It's just really fitting and some really nice eye candy to enjoy right at the beginning of the movie. I also loved the really futuristic while keeping it kind of historical theme throughout this film. It kind of feels like BioShock, how it has this sci-fi industrial feel to it, and I love that about Treasure Planet. Jim Hawkins as the main protagonist was pretty cool too, how he was a hard-ass punk kind of character, and how he was a pacifist and didn't really care too much at the beginning, and then he ended up being this hero by the end of the film. He was a pretty interesting protagonist, and I really liked the battle between camaraderie and enemies between him and the main villain Silver. Silver was also a dope villain, one of my favorites in 2000s Disney. All the moments in which the characters are traveling aboard or on that little surfboard thing that Hawkins is on, these are all really beautifully shot animated scenes, and all the characters on board are pretty cool too, and pretty consistent, I may add, except for that one farting character. That shit was just not funny, and that made me think that maybe Treasure Planet was the birth of the oversaturated and unfunny fart and shit jokes that we would get later on in Disney. The one scene towards the beginning of the movie when the doctor is talking to the farting monster or whatever it's called, it's just so unfunny and cringy and made me actually pause the movie for 5 seconds and think, what the hell? But speaking on about the Doctor, I thought Dr. Dad was a pretty cool character. He was really likable. His jokes did land for most of the time. And he was just a really helpful, likable, and cool, nice character throughout the entire film. To put it simply, he really did feel like a loving father in this movie. And I love that about his character and the interactions between him and Jim Hawkins. But then there was the robotic Ben character. And Ben was probably the worst robot character I have ever witnessed in a kids film. That goes for Astro Boy, which actually has some great robot characters, the Robots movie, which I hated, and accounting all the other sci-fi robot animated movies I've ever seen, Ben is the most treacherous, unfunny, and annoying robot character I've ever seen, and I'm pretty sure everybody can agree with that statement. Overall, I think Treasure Planet was just a really consistent movie. I mean, the visuals are really beautiful throughout. Every single scene between Dr. Dad, Jim Hawkins and Silver were all pretty great, and that specifically takes up the middle to the later half of the movie. But I also do think there are some scenes that could have been cut out, and that goes, of course, for the fart and shit jokes, and that goes for all the stupid, unfunny dialogue moments between other random characters aboard the ship during travel. In total, I feel like if you took out all those excess, stupid, unfunny scenes and that strange dancing scene at the end of the movie, which I'm pretty sure had that one chick that Mike Wazowski liked from Monsters Inc. in it, if you catch that one moment. And if you get rid of all those scenes in total, the movie would be 15-20 minutes shorter, and I really do think that I would have liked it a lot more if those scenes were excluded from the film. And although the ultimate climax ending was pretty generic, I did like the interaction between Silver and Jim Hawkins at the end of the film, and I thought it was a nice little come together of all the characters for no more retaliation and no more hatred towards one another. I really like the flip-flop, back and forth, comrade and enemy friendship between Silver and Jim Hawkins throughout, like I mentioned earlier. I thought that was a really cool dynamic. At the end of the day, I love Treasure Planet. I thought it was beautiful, slightly more beautiful than Atlantis, but I do think there was some scenes holding it back, such as the unfunny jokes and the ending dance scene, which I really wish they didn't include. But besides that, Treasure Planet is great, and I can see the argument for it being even higher. F you, Brother Bear is amazing. It's not as amazing as it was when I first saw it back in the 2000s, but there are still plenty of factors in Brother Bear that hold up tremendously well in today. Firstly, I still love the nice melodic background chanting going on throughout Brother Bear and the beautiful choruses. I think it just enhances the prehistoric setting all the more better. And speaking about the setting in and of itself is very strong, and how it takes place during supposedly or what seems to be the Ice Age. And I like how throughout the film the environment is constantly changing. You get a fall, then you get a winter time and a summertime. It's never just the same stagnant type of weather or biome, so to speak. And I love that about Brother Bear. It's constantly changing. And you also get that very strong bond and kinfolk brotherly connection between not only Kenai and Koda, but also with the human brothers at the beginning of the film. I will say it time and time again, the beginning of Brother Bear, when one of the brothers dies and falls off the cliff with the brother, is one of the most iconic, heartbreaking, and heartwarming moments in all of 2000s Disney. The beginning of Brother Bear is just really, really strong. With brother being in the title, it really does deliver in that brotherly and camaraderie aspect very, very well. And although Kenai is kind of a douche at the beginning of the film, towards the middle, Koda is continuously just really likable, funny, and he's just a really enjoyable and cute character to say the least. But by the end of the film, Kenai is a better character, and I just really like the duo between Koda and Kenai. It's a very solid combination. Tug was also a really cool secondary character, also a very good mentor style character. However, just like most of the other films on this list so far, there is bad characters that come alongside with the good, and Brother Bear has some of the most annoying secondary characters in all of 2000s Disney. First being the mountain goats, or rams to be more specific. That one scene where they're talking about the relationship with the other ram is just such a filler scene. It's so annoying and unfunny, and it's also accompanied with some really shitty voice acting. And that's not just for the rams, that also goes for the moose that pop up throughout the movie and are supposed to act as mentor characters, I guess. But they also just fill in with a lot of filler scenes, and they're not that likable characters, and they're also pretty annoying. So I think the main drawback in Brother Bear is probably the shitty supporting characters. I mean, you got a couple of good ones, for example, Tug and the grandmother at the beginning with the humans. But other than that, the supporting characters are just filler characters and they're pretty damn annoying. Another flaw I want to point out is the salmon run scene, because Coda is making it this big deal, like it's going to be some monumental moment to Kenai at the beginning of the film, and once they get to the salmon run, it's kind of anticlimactic. It's just a bunch of bears in like this little pond, and it ends up not being that exciting, and that's unfortunate because Coda is like hyping it up so heavily at the beginning of the film, and it's like the #1 thing the watcher is looking towards at the beginning of the film. Luckily, that doesn't take away from the stunning landscape graphics we get throughout the film. I mean, it's so constant and it's so consistent and it's so beautiful, just the landscape shown in this prehistoric setting. And then you get the beautiful ending to Brother Bear, which to me is like a combination of what made everything about the movie great. You get amazing melodic chanting choruses in the background. You get stunning graphics with like this Northern Lights style of spiritual transition going on. Kenai and Coda get to interact with their family members that have died in the past, and it's just such a heartwarming and amazing ending, and remains one of my favorite endings in any Disney film. So yeah, Brother Bear is definitely one of my favorite Disney films from the 2000s. As a kid, I would say it probably was my favorite. This was like the greatest thing ever when I was a little kid. But upon rewatch, it's not as great as it was, but it's still an amazing movie. And I get plenty of nostalgia from it, and there's some great moments throughout, specifically the beginning and the end, and there are some great moments throughout the middle. So Brother Bear is great, and I think it belongs in the top 5. At number 3 is the first animated picture from Disney in the 2000s. Now, to let you guys know, I just changed my mind in the number 3 spot like 15 minutes ago. I sat through it, I thought about it for a minute, I was like, you know what, I think 2 is slightly better than 3 in terms of memorability. And I just often come back to number 2 more, so I decided to put that over The Emperor's New Groove. But wait, that's not to take away from Emperor's New Groove, because this is one of the most fun movies in the Disney catalog, and I love the dog chase cat theme of this movie. It's just such a fun, epic story, and it's so exciting. Firstly, how about them characters? You have Kuzco, who is an amazing narcissistic main character, and he plays that role of a narcissist and really a character that only cares about himself so well. And then you have Pacha, who's one of my favorite mentor characters, and he's voiced by the iconic John Goodman, may I add, who is of course responsible for the goat Sully from Monsters Inc. And then you have Krunk, who has the same voice actor as Joe Swanson, and I crack up every single time I hear his voice because I just think about Joe Swanson immediately. But every single scene with Krunk is awesome, it's so funny, it's exciting, and the jokes have aged tremendously. And you know, I think it's hard sometimes for Disney movies to have comedy that ages well, and comedy that's actually funny, to be frank. But I think The Emperor's New Groove is unironically one of the funniest movies in all of Disney, hands down. And of course, the comedy is only enhanced by the across-the-board great voice acting cast. And I forgot to mention, I just really like the subtly placed slapstick comedy throughout this movie. How they really just are really good at sneaking in these stupid little jokes here and there. For example, when Yzma in cat form is falling from the top of the skyscraper thing, and she lands on the trampoline, that was hilarious. But Joe Swanson, I mean Krunk, is definitely the funniest character in the movie, but he's not my favorite. That definitely goes to Pacha. He was an iconic mentor character. And like I mentioned, I love the dog chase cat 2v2 theme going on throughout this movie. It just makes it really entertaining, and it kind of makes it a nail biter throughout the runtime. And for example, my favorite scene when it's dog chase cat is when they're at the diner and Kuzco keeps walking in and out of the diner and Yzma keeps walking in and out of the diner and they almost get caught. That was a very suspenseful scene for a kids movie, I may say. And of course, as we go down this list and we're getting closer to 1, the flaws don't really become flaws anymore, and instead they become tiny little minuscule bothersome nitpicks. And one of those nitpicks I thought was Pacha's kids. They weren't that funny, and they popped in and out of the screen every now and then, and they were just annoying and loud, and they weren't that funny, and it kind of takes away from the consistent jokes throughout the movie. But fortunately, they don't take up too much of the runtime because the movie is only sitting at 72 minutes, and it's really smooth all the way through. But I think the scenes with Pacha's kids, if they were removed, it would have been a little bit more enjoyable. One other small little nitpick I noticed while watching The Emperor's New Groove, I do think they take a little bit too long at the beginning of the movie to flesh out the characters, and it's a little bit too much dialogue from Kuzco, but I do like Kuzco more at the ending than I do at the beginning. but David Spade does kill the voice acting. I just think there's too much dialogue and too much fleshing out of the characters at the beginning. I also wanted to say that every single moment shared between Pacha and Cusco was awesome. I love their brotherly connection, similar to Brother Bear, just on a higher echelon. Every single moment in which they were together, it was either wicked funny or it was suspenseful. I think the moments when they're getting chased by Yzma and Krunk, all of those scenes are wicked suspenseful for a kids movie. And that scene when they have to get to the top of the cliff and they have to work together as a team, that was awesome. One of my favorites in the movie for sure. Ultimately, The Emperor's New Groove was such a great start to the 2000s for Disney. This movie has some of the best comedy in all of Disney and has aged tremendously. It has amazing characters, it has an amazing classical historical setting, and it's just one of the least flawed Disney pictures from the 2000s. So, with that being said, it definitely belongs in the top 3, and I can see it even being debated number 2 and number 1. And here is the big reveal. We are finally down to the last 2. What will be my number 1 and what will be my number 2? So at number 2, I have Princess and the Frog. So this was the movie that I ultimately decided to put over The Emperor's New Groove. While it was close, I ended up choosing Princess and the Frog. And here are some quick facts about The Princess and the Frog when pertaining to 2000s Disney. Number 1, musically, this is the best movie in 2000s animated Disney. 2, it has the best visual aesthetic based around classical New Orleans and Southern style. And 3, it is a genuine great return to the musical animation concept that was heavily involved in the 1990s. This is, of course, a lot of older Disney fans' favorite from the 2000s as well, because it is a princess movie. It's, of course, within the same vein of Beauty and the Beast, Little Mermaid, Cinderella, Sleeping Beauty, and all these other classical princess Disney stories. Not only was this a return to the princess Disney movies, but it also kind of got Disney out of a little dark age. If you look at the timeline of Disney, 2004 to 2007 was definitely not a good couple of years for Disney. You had Home on the Range, you had The Wild as probably the number 1 component. You just had a couple of rough releases for Disney between those couple of years, and that was essentially one of the worst time periods for Disney. But then Princess and the Frog came out, and it kind of led to a stream of great princess Disney movies to come after in the next decade. For example, you then got Tangled, Frozen, Moana, and even within the past couple years, there's been good Disney princess movies thanks to Princess and the Frog bringing back that concept. Now, to the nitty-gritty, what makes this movie so great? Firstly, I want to talk about the music. In my opinion, this is probably musically a top 3 Disney movie of all time. All the constant soulful Motown and gospel sing-alongs in this movie are so memorable and catchy. All the songs at the beginning, and of course the closing song when Lewis ends up being on stage with the big boys, that was awesome and such a heartwarming experience. And pretty much all of the big saxophone and horn moments throughout this movie, all the songs are just so memorable. I also think Princess and the Frog has an amazing cast of characters. I think Naveen was great as a secondary character. Lewis is absolutely amazing and one of my favorites. I think Old Ray was really, really cool and had some great voice acting. And I think Shadow Man as the main villain, he was awesome and very, very uniquely written and a very unique way of villaining as well. And when speaking about the visual aesthetic of the movie, I think that New Orleans is executed amazing and the music only enhances that. And that kind of makes when they were in the bayou a little bit of an inconvenience visually, because New Orleans at the beginning and ending was just so amazing. And although I do like the transition in the bayou in a writing stance, I just think visually it kind of was lacking in comparison to the scenes in New Orleans. If they somehow made it so the bayou scene had more involvement with like the New Orleans visual that they had at the beginning and end, I would have liked the bayou a little bit more, because for me, my thought point of the bayou, it was just a river in the forest with some pretty scenes with the fireflies, but other than that, the bayou wasn't that aesthetically pleasing in comparison to other parts of the movie. Because my take on it is, if you're going to make the aesthetic such a strong point of the movie, why not just have it all the way through and not just have an inconvenience like the bayou? But again, that is a small little nitpick, because the moments in the bayou are actually very, very important to learn about Lewis, who is my favorite character in the entire movie, hands down, and the character development moments between Tiana and Naveen. So to speak, the bayou was also very, very important. I also think the scenes with Mama Odie weren't that pleasing as well. I also thought her little area wasn't that cool, and Mama Odie as a character wasn't that amazing either. But thankfully, that's only a couple minutes of the movie and doesn't take up too much screen time. And then that leads me to talk about the last and small little flaw I have about the movie, and that is Princess Tiana. I think she is a good character, but in the same vein, I do think she is a very rudimentary character. She has one motive, and that's to have her own restaurant, and she doesn't really have any charmful imperfections like a lot of classical Disney main characters do. For example, Aladdin is a beggar and a thief and doesn't really have it. Ariel is just wicked gullible. Simba is not what his father is, but wants to be what his father was, and Moana is practically the same thing as Ariel. But Tiana doesn't really have any major imperfection that's holding her back like a lot of other great protagonists do. Of course, she has the strong motive to have her own restaurant one day, but throughout the movie, there's never really any moments in which the motive to have her own restaurant is holding her back from growing and becoming back to a human again. Like, how did becoming a frog help her get her own restaurant in the first place? It seemed like at the beginning of the movie, she had multiple jobs and she was very hardworking and talented, and then she just turned into a frog for a couple of days, and then all of a sudden, bam, back to a human, and she has her own restaurant. Like, I'm really lost at how she got the restaurant. Maybe I need to rewatch the movie, or someone needs to give me a history lesson about Princess and the Frog in the comments, because I saw no growth of her becoming a restaurant owner while she was a frog. But I can give Tiana the benefit of the doubt because I do think she has some flaws that can kind of balance out the good and bad in her character. I do think she has an amazing voice actor, she has a nice character design, and she's one of the more mature Disney characters. Oh, and John Goodman makes another appearance in this movie as Big Daddy LaBouffe, and yet again, an amazing John Goodman appearance in a Disney movie and another classic character. Too bad he's only in the movie for like 5 to 10 minutes, but whatever, he still has great moments when he is in the movie. So if you're keeping track, yes, I do think Princess and the Frog has more flaws than The Emperor New Groove, but when accounting all of the amazing peaks about this movie, I do like Princess and the Frog slightly more. I think it's visually more pleasing. I think it may have equal great characters. And I just think the ending and beginning of this movie are stronger than The Emperor's New Groove. But ultimately, I love Princess and the Frog, and that leaves us with one more movie. So yeah, I'm just gonna go out on a limb and say that Lilo and Stitch is hands down the best 2000s Disney movie. And I'll even go as far as to say that I think this movie is battling in the top 3 with the Renaissance films as well. I can put Lilo and Stitch neck and neck with Beauty and the Beast, Hunchback of Notre Dame, Tarzan, Aladdin, Beauty and the Beast. I think Lilo and Stitch is just as much quality-wise as those films. This is just such a fun, colorful, heartbreaking, and heartwarming, triumphant, amazing dog chase cat scenario movie that is essentially one of the least flawed Disney projects to come out in the past 30-40 years. This movie is just stellar. Where do I even begin? The friendship between Lilo and Stitch, the two main characters, is one of the strongest duos in any Disney film, hands down. The dynamic duo of Lilo and Stitch, when those two are the only two on the screen, every single moment is adored. Every single moment is so much fun and silly. And I just personally love all of those moments when they're together on screen. And the same can go for when Nani and Lilo are on the screen together. I think those two share a really strong sisterly bond. The two of them make for just some of the most heartwarming, heartbreaking, and introspective moments in the movies. And I love the dynamic of how when Lilo and Stitch are together, it's always childish and silly. And then there's moments when Lilo and Nani are together, and these scenes are a lot more serious, mature, and heartbreaking. The overall production of Lilo and Stitch is just top-notch as well. I mean, the setting, the sound design, the colors. For example, when they're on the beach and all the trees and the sky, it's just such a colorful movie. And the VAs in this movie are stellar. Whoever did the voice acting for Stitch, who I need to catch up on, they did an amazing job doing his voice acting, making all those little cute alien noises. I really loved how the setting and the colors and aesthetic are done so perfectly, but they still didn't make that take away from great character development, character moments, and the duo between Lilo and Stitch. This is really a movie you can enjoy to watch in terms of animation, but you can also watch it as a family to have some laughs and get closer with one another. I also loved how the setting and characters was very limited and only takes place in the small little town and in outer space for a brief moment, and it only has a couple characters, all in which I loved. I think the other secondary characters like Jumba, David, Cobra, they were all great characters, as well as the Grand Councilwoman. Although we don't get too much of her in this movie, I think it's just a small, short, and sweet little understandable story. It's not like this giant, grand, spectacular, tremendous explosion, action-packed movie like Treasure Planet or Atlantis. It's just this small, short, little hometown story that anybody can enjoy. And I don't think that's a flaw at all. I think it works in its charm perfectly, how it's a more understandable, childish, and kiddie movie. It's kind of like the 2000s version of Little Mermaid, if that makes sense. How it's a very small story with little characters, and it's just very comedic and understandable, especially for littler kids. Ultimately, I think the only flaw in this movie is that it takes a little bit too long to actually get into the good stuff of the story. We're getting to know more about the aliens, more about Grand Councilwoman, and the powers of Stitch, and how he's just a wicked overpowered, like, Hulk type character in such this small little frame. I think it takes too long to actually get into the island, to get into the story, and I do find it kind of unfortunate that we don't get to meet at all Lilo and Nani's parents, but that's not even a part of the story, and you can't really include what ifs when talking about the best movies, so I'm just gonna leave that out of there as a small, tiny little flaw. Overall, Lilo and Stitch is such an adorable, fun, colorful, and reliable rewatch experience that I think is probably, out of all 14 movies on this list, definitely the least flawed and most memorable. So that is why Lilo and Stitch is going to top my list at number 1. And that will do it, folks. In retrospective, the 2000s was definitely a drop-off from the 1990s. I can just tell from when I binge-watched the Renaissance and then I binge-watched the 2000s. I had much more fun watching the 90s movies, but that doesn't mean that the 2000s didn't have some great highs. You had beginning of the 2000s, which was really strong, with pictures such as, of course, Lilo and Stitch, Treasure Planet, and Emperor's New Groove to kick off the 2000s. And then it ended on a very strong note with Princess and the Frog, and there was some good sprinkled in between. But the 2000s obviously did have a really dark age in the middle of the 2000s, from like 2004 to 2007. But you gotta take the good with the bad. I mean, every single era of Disney has bad stuff, or at least some of it, and they also all have great stuff. So that will do it for my list, number 14 to number 1. If you guys would like to see me rank another era of Disney, perhaps before the 1990s with the Bronze Age or the Silver Age, or you would like me to do after the 2000s, I could also rank the 2010s, which was the era I'm probably most familiar with in Disney, and I won't need to do that much rewatching. So I could probably pop that out in a couple weeks. But thank you guys for watching. I had a blast making this list. I had a blast rewatching these movies. And of course, I'll see you all later. Peace out.